Hello everyone, you can call me Freebiewits, and I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Analyse and Adapt Season 2, where I see if a TV series would work in 3 different mediums. Tabletop as in board and card games, tabletop roleplay like Dungeons and Dragons, and finally as a LARP. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, these little things really do help the channel. Anyways, from the creators of Peppa Pig, which I do adore, we're taking a look at The Big Knights! And yes, that's how you pronounce it. If you pronounce it as The Big Knights, you're doing it wrong, but for the sake of protecting your eardrums, I'll pronounce it wrong. Just for you. For those of you sad little people who don't know what The Big Knights are, it's a children's cartoon about, well, allow me to quote the show directly. The height of 2 men, the weight of 4, the strength of 16. Sir Boris, finest swordsman in the world, and his brother, Sir Maurice, not the finest swordsman in the world, but the most enthusiastic, and their noble pets, Sir Horace the dog, and Sir Doris the hamster, the Big Knights! Fun fact, Sir Maurice was voiced by Brian Blessed, and if you don't know who that is, then please stop watching this video right now and look him up. In fact, please stop watching this video if you haven't seen The Big Knights. Just watch it. Watch it on YouTube. It's fantastic. It's amazing. It's The Big Knights. Anyways, with that intro out of the way, let's charge recklessly into tabletop. The entirety of The Big Knights can be boiled down to 2 overpowered idiot brothers, their pets, and an underfunded kingdom going through a series of unfortunate events with humorous results. Now, I know I just described them as 2 idiots, but if violence solves everything, then who's really the dumb one, eh? Anyways, in that regard, I can see 2 different kinds of games when taking a tabletop approach for this show. The first is a kingdom management game where you do everything in your power to make said kingdom successful. You're besieged by a greedy skinflint of a king, the various magical and non-magical dangers that occur throughout the series, and of course the Big Knights and their attempts to solve said dangers, likely causing more issues than solving them in the first place. To that end, I suggest all those dangers have a timer in that they stick around for a certain amount of time doing damage to the kingdom. They could be dealing actual damage in destroying infrastructure, stealing resources, or anything in between. At any rate, the nobles of the land can take a vote on whether they should call the Big Knights, who would remove the threat but of course destroy a bunch of stuff in the process. You know, collateral damage and all that stuff. In my mind, it would play a sort of risk-reward system, a game of chicken if you would. To make the Big Knights seem like a better offer, some of these dangers, instead of running out on their own after a while, could just get bigger and bigger until they're unmanageable. A lot of strategy in that sort of game could result. Unfortunately, this kind of game has a lot of forethought, strategy, and planning, risking the pros and cons of doing certain actions, thus killing the spirit of the Big Knights. The second, more exciting option is less about thinking and more about knocking stuff over. When I talk about tabletop games, most folks might think of Warhammer, Risk, or even Monopoly, along with the classics like chess and backgammon. But tabletop games can also involve things like Mousetrap, King of Tokyo, and even Throw Burrito. Look them up, I'm sure you'll have a laugh. For this TV show, I can imagine a miniature destructible pachinko or bowling type game with these characters. The Big Knights would be represented by large plastic balls, with various other characters and events represented by standing cards or figures, all made of cardboard and such. The playing field would be a gentle slope where the players would let their balls roll down and knock over said cards or figurines. Certain cards like witches and goblins would be worth extra points, where houses, princesses, and probably the king would deduct points if knocked over. On the slope would be various circles with numbers on them, which would help determine where the knockable figurines would be standing. It could be randomized or predetermined based on a specific scenario. Now, knowing how I worked as a child, I'd likely just peg the balls at all the figurines regardless of points values or rules, all in the name of fun. And in the end, that's what the Big Knights are. Big piles of fun. Honestly, that kind of ties into the whole idea of the Big Knights rather well, I think. Simple but fitting. Anyways, with that out of the way, let's move on to tabletop roleplay. Technically, The Big Knights is already a really immature, but let's be honest here, very fun, romp in a pseudo-fantasy world, meaning their characters can be taken directly from the show and adapted into just about any fantasy-type game already. That said, besides the extra strength, boisterous behavior, and their everything-eating hamster, the only thing I'd really change or add to the system is destructible environments and collateral damage. Now, don't get me wrong, every D&D DM I've ever met has always had a tavern or inn burned down once the wizard casts a fireball, but I don't think I've ever seen one have the fighter break an entire building because they were too strong. It's one thing to have someone roll a natural one and set off a series of destructive events that happens to end in something breaking, and another thing to have them all roll normally and have things go hilariously wrong anyways. Or right, depending on the context, I suppose. In a big night sort of game, on top of tracking player hit points, we'd have to track collateral damage, which, while normally hard, is made a lot more manageable by the fact that we only have 2 big knights, rather than the traditional adventuring party of 4 to 6. To that end, a big night tabletop roleplay system could be adapted to a giant monster kaiju type game as well. Wait, no, that wouldn't work. For all their collateral damage, the big knights rarely, if ever, use the environment to their advantage. Sometimes they do it accidentally, but most of the time they just use their swords to bash stuff. In that regard, I guess I have to lean on the natural one idea a bit more. Now, bear with me for a moment. In D&D, there are optional fumble tables that people have made for whenever you roll a natural one on a 20-sided dice. When you roll on these tables, sometimes nothing happens. Sometimes you accidentally attack an ally, and sometimes you actually let go of your weapon and get your weapon stuck in something. For the big knights, I could use a more forgiving but destructive version of a fumble table. One that would trigger more often. I would call it the collateral damage table. In fact, I'm making it right now, just as I'm writing this script. Check out the finished product in the comments below and tell me what you'd change about the table, if anything at all. Also, feel free to use it yourself and let me know how it went. Now, I know what most of you are thinking. This probably wouldn't be good for a long-term campaign, but it would be a nice palate cleanser for something silly and enjoyable. A good one-shot or something to be revisited every now and then. Now, with tabletop role-playing done, let's do something a bit more lively. And by lively, I mean live, as in live-action roleplay. LARP is an expensive hobby. I don't think that's a controversial statement at all. That said, it doesn't have to be as expensive if you're just playing a robe-wearing, foam-throwing mage, but if you want to wear metal armor like the big knights, it's going to cost you quite a bit, and that's ignoring foam swords, which are also ridiculously expensive. In Australia, a decent Calamisol sword is worth at least $150, and that's not even counting shipping costs. I mean, sure, I can buy one of those toy foam swords from Target, Kmart, or some dollar store, but with the amount they're used, I'd be throwing away money at that point and littering the area with destroyed pieces of foam. Speaking of destroyed pieces of anything, collateral damage isn't really a thing we can do in LARP, at least not on a practical level. We, as players, can always roleplay a building coming apart around us. However, if there are multiple people involved in the scene, one person might imagine things getting destroyed slightly differently to everyone else. The more people involved, the more likely this is going to be an issue. I, for example, might imagine a hole appearing in a wall and jump through that, whereas everyone else might just imagine the wall staying intact. Point is, it just takes the immersion out of things. To help avoid that, there could be a game master watching over all the participants, and as I mentioned before, since it's mainly 2 big knights, it does become a bit more manageable at that point. That said, another way to do collateral damage is to use foam bricks and the like. Now, I know I said it wouldn't work on a practical level, but now that I think about it, it sounds like a fun idea to bash and destroy foam walls. Hell, they don't even need to be foam, just something light and easy to break apart like cardboard. Cardboard. Okay, actually, that could work. If you could have cardboard walls with cardboard pieces of furniture, and you'd have a village worth of destructible environment for a small price. If you want to bring the cost down even more, you could always just make your armor and weapons out of cardboard too and paint them up to look like the real thing. I mean, the Big Knights isn't exactly historically accurate or serious. I mean, it doesn't matter what you put on as long as it just looks good. Not only that, but cardboard LARP exists, so there's a precedent for this sort of thing. In every LARP I've ever been in, there's always a rule about respecting other people's equipment and not breaking it, but for the Big Knights and the village made out of literal cardboard, the opposite seems quite true. At that point, collateral damage isn't just possible, it's freaking encouraged. Sure, there would still be rules about breaking people's bones and their non-cardboard stuff, and maybe even their weapons, but everything else is free to bend, snap, and smash. Considering how cheap the king is in the Big Knights, having everything made of cardboard works too. This just keeps getting better. It thematically fits. That said, the main downside is what to do if it starts raining. Personally, as someone who owns a suit of metal armor, if it starts raining, I'm out. Screw the rust, I hate it. And that's how I imagine a Big Knights theme LARP to go. So that's my analysis of the Big Knights and how it can be adapted into 3 different mediums. How do you think it'd work? Have any of you tried adapting any elements of the show yourself? And if so, how did it go? Consider leaving a comment, liking the video, and subscribing. Sharing it would also help the channel. My name is Freebywits, and thank you for watching. And just because I really want to say it, the Big Knights! Dun 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 dun.